Thank you very much, Laura. It was a great presentation. I was trying to introduce myself, but you did it perfectly. So, but maybe to clarify what I'm presenting today and to contextualize it a little bit, as you said, this is part of my brother doctoral dissertation, and it's been a tricky paper. So I changed the topic. I changed the title, not the topic, yesterday actually, because I wasn't convinced with the one that I had sent. Maybe this one is a little bit clearer, hopefully. And I say it's been a tricky paper because I'm trying to patch together maybe three things: the broad argument of my dissertation around the changes of the state in both Mexico and Chile through education policy, the early parts of my dissertation on the coalitions that brought about these evaluation policies, and the later part of my dissertation about the effects, the political effects of these instruments on teacher unions in both countries. So maybe there's too much stuff on this for it to be a publishable paper, but hopefully you can give me some feedback on that. What I will be talking about, as Laura said, is teacher evaluation and specifically teaching standards. And what I'm interested in is in how they've been very differently justified, politicized, and introduced in two already very different countries as Mexico and Chile. So just to give you a little amuse-bouche, here are two justifications of this instrument in these countries. So on your left is the speech of former Mexican President Enrique Peña Nieto before introducing this evaluation, and he says, well, this constitutional reform that is necessary to transform teacher evaluation in the country is extremely important because it reaffirms the authority of the Mexican state over educational policy. And he goes on saying the rights of teachers will be, of course, safeguarded, but their entry, tenure, and promotion inside the profession will no longer be subjected to discretionary criteria, implicitly referring to the union control of teacher positions and basically educational policy. So in Mexico, we have a policy that is broadly conceived as an anti-union, anti-corporatism, but also anti-corruption policy. On your right, you have Giorgio Jackson, who was a former minister. I don't remember which portfolio he had during the Gabriel Boric government. This is a few years before, during the second Bachelet term. And he is extremely gleeful when they approved the teacher career path, same instrument to govern teacher performance, salaries, tenure, etc. And he says, since the end of the last century, teachers have raised the demand for a teaching career path. He presents this instrument as a demand of teachers. And he says, this is the aspect I value the most is that the resources that will be transferred to teachers as part of bonus for the salaries, complements, attributing depending on performance, is that this project contributes to de-voucherizing. So vouchers are the instrument for funding education in Chile, textbook adoption of the proposal of Milton Friedman in the 50s, insofar as these contributions are not delivered as demand-side subsidies. So in Chile, the project of evaluating teachers and governing their salaries through these evaluations is explicitly conceived as a sort of correction of market reforms in the 70s and 80s. So same instrument, two very different contexts, two very different political actors, two very different uses. So this led me to a sort of empirical puzzle, right? So first puzzle, why these two very different countries adopt the same instrument and what does it do in this context? But I've been trying to build on that puzzle to sort of build a more theoretical argument and a theoretical reflection on, is it possible that neo-managerial instruments such as this one, so evaluating teachers, accountability policies, pay for performance salaries, tenure conditional on evaluation results, etc., produce institutional convergence? And if they do so, of what kind? What sort of institutions do they produce in those such contrasting contexts? So the literature so far has been doing a sort of balancing move in between convergence and divergence, right? So early critical theories of new public management, neoliberalism, market reforms tended to conceive them as sort of overarching convergent wave around the world, right? Emerging from Thatcherite Britain and Reaganite economics, etc., neoliberal Chile during the Pinochet dictatorship, and a sort of wave diffusing around the world, right? And this is something that we find in early 1990s criticisms, but in more recent, accounts too. For instance, Miguel Ángel Centeno and Agustín Ferraro co-edited an edited volume on the neoliberal state in Latin America, considering it a sort of institutional blueprint for the region, right? But also some work on privatization today has been studying how privatization occurs in all contexts, all the time, etc. More nuanced, politically savvy work has, on the contrary, been attentive. This is what I call politics-centric research on how politics, political coalitions, political interests diverge in different contexts, of course, as we know, as different institutions shape different interests and lead to institutional divergence or eventually continuities, right? So classical works like Monica Prasad works on market reforms, etc. So at the end of the day, countries remain different, although they neoliberalize, right? Something that is of particular relevance here is how this, say, comparative political economy tradition conceives of interest. This is very important for me in this presentation because they create this sort of model where interest and the veto power of actors, particularly teacher unions in the case of education policy, lead to specific coalitions and eventually to specific instruments and reforms, right? A very different tradition on which I try to insert myself and discuss and eventually complement is what I call the policy-centric literature specializing on policy instruments, right? So same or very similar intellectual trajectory from an early intentionalist view of instruments as reflections of political rationalities or instruments as carrying an implicit political theorization. This is the work of Pierre Lascoume and Patrick Le Gallès, who worked with us at Sciences Po. But also similar work on policy transfer, epistemic communities, etc. So how, at the end of the day, these experts behind the scenes were carrying these tools with their implicit political rationalities. Newer work on instrument constituencies brings the equation, puts the equation on its head, right? So, as I said, interest coalition lead to instruments in the more comparative politics tradition. In this tradition, it is instruments who shape interest and who in turn build constituencies, right? This is the work of Simons and Boss, but also the work of Belland and Howlett on instrument. Excuse me. Whoa, sorry. On instrument constituencies, right? Basically, what they say is that the instrument is ambiguous. What it tries to do can be very different for different actors, which leads to its adoption for different reasons, building a sort of collective actor that does not reflect the sole interest of, say, unions or political parties or experts, right? This leads to me the open question of what are the conditions under which instruments produce eventually convergence or this divergence that has been already well studied by the comparative politics tradition, right? So, and I try to build my argument around what I call instrument coalitions, and this is the title of my presentation, right? So, what the instrument constituencies literature does very well is studying how experts rally around an instrument, how they eventually put it on the forth of agenda setting processes, how they interest political actors, etc. But there's a missing link about politics, right? For instance, Belland and Howlett in their paper on the topic, they say instrument constituencies are very different from advocacy coalitions. These are two different things, and there's a sort of political division of labor where experts craft solutions, they chase problems, and then political actors take it from their hands and say, don't worry, we'll bring it about in legislative settings, in public settings, etc. Well, it says this doesn't necessarily reflect the reality of things, and we have to move beyond this sort of analytical division of labor, of instrument constituencies and advocacy coalitions as being different animals, right? But also moving beyond the intellectual division of labor in between, say, politic-centric analysis in comparative politics and policy-centric analysis in policy analysis, etc., and trying to blend both. And I do so through taking inspiration in the work of Jacob Hacker, Paul Pearson on what they call policy-focused analysis, but also through the tools they have developed, you know them very well, on feedback effects and coalitional dynamics, right? And my model of instrument coalitions follows this sort of logic. I say, taking from instrument constituencies, yes, instruments are ambiguous. Yes, they can rally different interests and shape them and build constituencies, but these constituencies need to act politically. So they need to enroll political actors, they need to negotiate with teacher unions, with broader unions, and in doing so, they do two things. One is legitimating the instrument, saying, why is this important? Why is this necessary? Why this solution responds to these problems? And they need to include and exclude actors in the coalition, right? Very intuitive. But in doing so, in building these coalitions, they disambiguate the instrument, this sort of ambiguous power that granted political cloth to the instrument, and they feed back into the interest of the actors that have participated in the coalition, leading to eventually policy continuity or rupture. So this is what I call mainly the ambiguity to disambiguation mechanism, right? Saying the instrument was ambiguous, but in being politicized, in being carried in political settings, it gets disambiguated, which leads to this sort of feedback effects in the traditional analytical tradition of feedback effects. So symbolic, redefining the legitimate role of actors in the policy process, material in redistributing resources to teachers, to their unions, and eventually political in shaping political relationships, mainly in between unions and the party, but also in between unions and the state. So I was a bit quick in all of this, but I can come back to specific parts of the argument if you feel it's necessary to clarify it. I'm going to start getting into the empirics now because I see time is running quickly. So to understand the broader context I'm studying, this is the moment that starts in the 1990s, right? So in Latin America, after market reforms in the 80s, we see most international organizations, the World Bank, the OECD, start reflecting and proposing about what they call second-generation reforms, right? And reforms that are explicitly calling for state building and institutional consolidation efforts. And these education policies I'm studying fit, they even are considered as the cornerstone of these second-generation reforms, right? Because of the whole knowledge economy discourse, escaping the middle income trap through the construction of human capital, et cetera, et cetera. So education reform is very important, but in the midst of education reform, teacher reform is very important for these actors because unions are veto power actors, they are blocking reform, so we need to reform teachers to reform education, in a way. And because, as the comparative politics of education show, teacher unions were mainly the big survivors of market reforms in Latin America. If you take, for instance, the Mexican teacher union, it's 1.6 teachers, all mandatorily affiliated to the union, huge political machine shaping electoral results in 2006, even in 2018. So big actors, especially in Mexico. But as I was saying at the beginning of my presentation, these are two very different cases, right? So this Mexican political machine, corporatist union, we do not find it in Chile. In Chile, we have a small union, classic interest group, dependent on political parties, especially from those of the left. So, and in a privatized education setting. So I have here a small table. So as you say, only 17% of teachers in Chile are affiliated to the union, contrary to, well, 100% in Mexico is a sort of artificial number, but the Mexican union is able to mobilize like eventually around tens of thousands of teachers during electoral processes, etc. And it's very active in high politics, right? Presidential politics, etc. Two very different educational systems. So roughly 60% of students are in private or charter schools in Chile, contrary to only 10-12% in Mexico. Less than 50% of teachers work in public schools in Chile, contrary to 82% in Mexico. So this is as far as it gets as cases in Latin America, as we have in Latin America, right? Very different trajectories of neoliberalization. So two very different contexts. And what my analytical strategy to study them is what Locke and Phelan call the contextualized comparison. So I'm not gonna get into the details, but what they say is it's important to consider that the meaning of politics, of policy instruments, of reforms changes depending on the context, although the instrument can be called the same, right? So teacher evaluation is the same instrument in Mexico and Chile, but what it means, how political actors use it, is very different. This is not a reason to not compare them, but we need to consider these contextual factors into the comparison and eventually look for what they call analytically parallel processes, even if formally diverse, to compare. So what I'm comparing is not Mexico and Chile as a whole, but I'm comparing the processes of coalition building and the politics of these evaluation processes in both countries. Ideally to highlight the unexpected parallels across these very different cases. So these are the policy instruments. I can come back to that. Well, I work mainly through qualitative methods and qualitative data, mainly through interviews, archival materials. So this is a table of my interviews. I can put it back afterwards, but to the narration, right? So what happened in Chile? Chile, basically, evaluation policy in Chile, this is introduced in 2004, but it's crafted since the end of the 90s as a solution to the big problem in Chile, which is teacher salaries. Teacher salaries have been completely decimated during the privatization reforms of the late 70s and 80s. Teachers have to take several jobs. Teachers are market actors, right? They don't have any functional protections as state employees because they no longer are state employees. And on top of that, they are evaluated by the principals who have been nominated by the dictatorship agents, and that can use evaluation as sort of discretionary power for licensing left-wing teachers, etc. So a very dire situation in the 90s, and in that context, policy experts start thinking about what we need is three things: is professionalization, because professionalization will allow us to grant higher salaries to teachers, and on top of that, it will allow us to progressively reincorporate them to the state. And they are very close during the opposition years of the regime to the leadership of the union, the Teachers College, who buys into this idea, but with the priority of salary augmentation, right? And this is from the archives in Chile in '97, the leadership of the Teachers Union, the Teachers College, saying performance evaluation is necessary and desirable. We need to get out of the control of principals in schools, and with a sort of centralized bureaucratic mode of evaluation, which on top of that will allow us to have better salaries. These sort of structural promises of evaluation, and both experts and the union are pretty consensual on this, right? But they need to build a coalition for passing this reform, which of course right-wing parties oppose, because it's sort of teacher-friendly, because of course the best person is the manager to evaluate the employees, so they prefer that principals keep on evaluating teachers. Local administrations don't like this very much either. But there's a sort of window of opportunity in 2001, when Ricardo Lagos, the first socialist president of Chile after the transition, is elected. He's a former minister of education. He signs a pact with the teacher union during his election campaign, saying, okay, salary augmentations, but evaluation, right? Sort of trade-off in between the administration and the teachers union. Lagos is very important because he's the actor that will make also the trade-offs and the negotiations with the Ministry of Finance, which is sort of principal bureaucratic actor in Chile. And this is where we can see the ambiguity of the instrument, in that eventually it sort of gives all actors what they wanted for. The Ministry of Finance wanted incentives, so the evaluation will give incentives for teachers to raise their salaries. Teachers will get the sort of professional evaluation system that takes them out of the control of principals. The left will get the sort of new policy and sort of buying some teacher peace after a few years of huge demonstrations by teachers. And the result is this, the result is this second instrument, where it's mandatory, tenure is conditional on evaluation results, but eventually salaries are not conditional on evaluation. They will be raised through the voluntary system, so everyone gets more or less what they ask for.
Can I just ask for clarification? Does this concern the public and the charter?
Only public school teachers.
So not the charter ones?
Well, I'll get to them in a second.
Okay.
And this is important, thank you, Laura, because this is also what allows to avoid conflict with the right-wing parties that usually defend the rights of charter schools and private owners of charter schools. Some of them were ministers of education during the right-wing years. But this leaves open questions, right? So what happens with private school teachers, charter school teachers? What happens with salaries? Because eventually teachers don't have to be evaluated to improve their salaries. So there are a few ambiguities left, which will be resolved in the next sequence, which is 2016-2023, right? In 2016, new comeback of the left to the presidency. There's a second Bachelet government, and very, very ambitious policy of decommodification of education, right? So this is the gratuity of university education, this sort of end of profit in charter schools, huge fiscal reform to pay for all of this, and as a part of the package, the introduction of the career path for teachers, right? Sort of with the same coalition, the same legitimation strategy, saying this is good for teachers, this is going to professionalize teachers. This is what you ask for, eventually, a career path, as Giorgio Jackson was saying in the first slide. And as, sorry, in a way, it's able to deactivate the right-wing critique because it's focused on other topics such as the gratuity of education and the end of profit in charter schools, right? So eventually, right-wing parties say, okay for teacher evaluation in this way. This is not what they wanted. I can get into that on the rights alternative, but they eventually commit to this, which only only leaves dissident teachers, so the opposition to the union leadership, as opponents to this plan. And this sort of union opposition is important. I will get back to it afterwards, because they sort of lead to the clarification of the instrument, because they say, this is not what we asked for. This is a sort of neoliberal tool for control, because now, after this plan, which is the teacher's career, where both tenure and salaries will be conditional on evaluation results. So if you want to raise your salary, you need passing marks, which are, I don't want to get into too much detail, but you need high marks on evaluation to pass the different echelons of the career path. So this is no longer classical bureaucratic seniority leads to better salaries, right? And of course, it breaks the classical union demand of equal pay for equal work. And this is pay for performance. The problem being that they have no allies. So eventually they mobilize, they have, they call for boycott and not participating in the evaluations, etc. This is so generous that they eventually, a few years later, they request the administration that they allow the boycotting teachers to be incorporated into the system, because when you reach the higher echelon of the career, you're earning $3,000 as a teacher in public schools. So this is very generous. This kind of salary only concerns less than 1% of teachers, actually, but this is a very generous system. It costs, funding this costed almost 1 point of GDP, of Chilean GDP at the time. So it's a very ambitious system, and which has been basically institutionalized today. Very quickly, Mexico, evaluation means something radically different, right? So as I was saying, it is conceived by these policy experts in the administration, linked to the OECD, etc., as a tool of, yes, professionalization, yes, education quality, etc., etc. But the main problem, the sticking point, as Locke and Thelen call it in their paper, is not salaries, but recruitment. Because recruitment is the main political resource of the teachers' union. Teachers' union is very influential in teacher training schools. They manage the recruitment process through sort of clientelistic, politicized practices, and this is everyone knows about this, right? And sometimes the union boasts about it, saying this is important. This is what the union is for. Handling teacher careers, handling teacher policy. So in Mexico, the goal is not to reincorporate teachers to the state. The teachers are an integral part of the state, and they basically run education. Well, when I say the teachers, it's their union, which are two different things. So evaluation policy is designed to sort of break this link and differentiate the administration, the educational administration, and the union bureaucracy. So they build a very different coalition, right? Instead of trying to enroll teachers, of justifying the tool of evaluation as a sort of professionalizing and improving tool for teachers, they build it as a sort of tool to reassert the authority of the state, right? As I said in the first slide, which are very different coalitions. So it's a sort of cross-party coalition, contrary to Chile, where Chile is the left wing who is pushing for these evaluation policies. Here we have a sort of cross-party. This is institutional revolutionary party government but also with the support of the National Action Party, the sort of right wing party, and the PRD, the Democratic Revolutionary Democratic Partido de la Revolución Democrática, easier party, which is sort of center-left party. So, and they signed the Pacto for Mexico, a sort of big structural reforms program, which includes this education reform. The coalition explicitly excludes the union, of course. Union leader Elba Ester Gordillo is arrested the day before the vote in the Legislative Assembly. She is arrested in the tarmac of Mexico City Airport, going down her private jet, coming back from a weekend in her mansion in San Diego. So corruption charges and money embezzlement charges were pretty evident. She was accused of embezzling more than $140 million from the union. It was very self-explanatory, right? But also the sort of union dissidents, which is very important in the south of Mexico, and which carries the sort of mobilization against this policy through very, very big process of mobilization in Mexico City and states such as Oaxaca and Chiapas, right? In this coalition, the policy is less ambiguous, but it's still relatively ambiguous in the sense that eventually the new union leadership supports the instrument. Of course, they were put there by the president, but they receive material resources to promote the evaluation. I have figures on that. Big chunks of money to promote evaluation, train teachers to the evaluation. So sort of are able to preserve their position inside the state and inside the policy process, but with no longer controlling recruitment, which is now dependent of competitive examinations, right? The sort of classical bureaucratic tool to recruit people inside the state, right? But as I was saying, big process of teacher mobilization against this. Teachers boycott evaluation in southern states with more than 80–90% of teachers not presenting evaluation. They boycott local elections, burning electoral material, stuff like that. 9 people die in demonstrations in Nochistlán in Oaxaca in 2016 in what is basically street fighting against the police. The army is deployed to secure evaluation processes in these states. So this is like a sort of militarized process at the end of the day. And I talked with people in the administration that had to be extracted from evaluation sites by helicopters and stuff like this. So this is like very violent process in Mexico, which leads to a huge partisan realignment, right? So basically heading towards the 2018 election, no party wants to touch a teacher evaluation. It's sort of toxic. They know they're going to lose the elections anyways because Andrés Manuel López Obrador is clearly the runner-up favorite for the election, and he allies with teachers, right? So he says teachers have been the only ones fighting against neoliberalism as I've been, so I'm going to give them what they want, the end of this sort of punitive election evaluation. And the result is that they abandon the instrument, right? The instrument has been consensually labeled as sort of neoliberal control policy. It's abandoned, but it's not really abandoned in the sense that this new coalition has no alternative to this evaluation process. And as I have here, you can see the new instrument, the career system for all teachers, basically rules the same processes. So who is hired, how, who is promoted, and how. And even gives some bonuses for teachers, but they drop the tenure conditionality. So you're evaluated, yes, it's mandatory to be evaluated, but only if you want to earn more salary. You cannot be fired if you have bad evaluation results. And the sticking point, which was who is recruited and how, remains because the union has no good argument against, well, you cannot decide who is hired because these sort of clientelistic policies, and they have no alternative to this. So the outcome, very fast, and I will conclude probably with this, is and this is what eventually I will try to build this into an argument of how these tools change the state in both countries, is that there's a substantial transformation of political strategies and coalitions of teacher unions in both countries. I haven't been able to get into the details of that, but basically the coalitions that were in place in the 90s in between unions and parties are broken up because of this mobilizing push of teacher dissidents against evaluation. saying, well, union leadership is betraying us by supporting these policies. And we see this by the realignment with Morena in Mexico and with the new left coalition in Chile, Unida por Chile, which was the coalition of Gabriel Boric and Janet Jara in the last elections. But if there are renewed partisan links, what's important is that there are no formal links in between. There are no longer formal links in between unions and parties as there were before. To take the case of the Chilean teachers, which is probably the most explicit of both, the leadership of the union used to be from one of the coalición, concertación parties, right? Either the Social Democrats, the Partido por la Democracia, etc. This sort of process of institutionalization of the evaluation policy plus mobilization against it has led to a new political sector of the union to take control of the union. And we can understand this because the union has been strongly demobilized, right? This is the enrollment in the Teachers College in Chile, which has lost almost 50% of its members since 2000. And this is as a token for the mobilization ability. The first year the evaluation process was in place, they were able to boycott it by almost one third. One third of the people that were meant to be evaluated didn't do it. And today is less than 1%, right? So huge demobilization through evaluation and the sort of collective action dilemmas it produces in the union, but at the individual level too. But also a very changed relationship to the state, because at the end of the day, what this evaluation process means is that there's no longer collective bargaining, which is the main tool of unions, right? So if your salary is determined by your performance, you have no longer the sort of economic role of your union is lost, right? Plus the fragmentation of the bureaucracies, but I have no need to get into that. Have no time. And of course, big continuities at the end of the day in both policies. As I said, in Chile it's evident, and in Mexico there are these sort of hidden continuities despite the new government's rhetoric against neoliberalism and etc., right? So at the end of the day, the instrument is very similar to the one before, except of conditionality. So to very briefly conclude, what I say is that I want this paper to highlight the heuristical interest of the contextualized comparison to compare two such contrasting cases, and to highlight how one similar, to not say the same policy instrument, has very different effects in very different cases, leading to similar outcomes, right? So sort of equifinality argument with a twist. And we can explain that through the operation of instrument coalitions, right? Which is the argument I'm trying to make here. And I think this is an important argument to make because this second generation public sector reforms have not been that much studied through this lens. There's the work of a colleague that I like very much, with Isabel Pereira in Cornell, who makes a very similar argument on health policy in the US and France, work on cross-class coalitions between managers and workers. But we need more work on that topic, not on labor in the private sector, but labor in the public sector. And people in the US and the American political economy tradition are starting to work on this. And I think the idea of instrument coalitions can be an interesting addition to this literature. And to open maybe the discussion is that like the undoing of these political relationships between parties and unions and the state is sort of indicative of broader political transformations where these processes of politicization lead to less and less political consequences, and the sort of policy continuity that we see in this table. So thank you very much for your attention. This is my email if you want to keep on discussing these topics with me. And I'm really looking forward to your feedbacks, questions, and criticisms, because as I said, this is a work in progress that I'm trying to build. So hopefully you'll have stuff to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Pablo. We have